Thank you for joining. And I would like to uh, welcome the audience. And over the next 45 minutes or so, it's my privilege and honor to be having some esteemed speakers on a very important topic that we probably as humanity have faced in for a couple of weeks now. And more importantly, we'll focus on how to address this in the context of and looking from a perspective of a premier academic institution, as well as from a technology point of view, and see what can we do to help and overcome or reduce the impact of COVID-19, especially on the supply chain disruption that it's causing. And we'll also touch upon the aspects around the bullwhip effect it's going to have. We'll define what that means and how you can prepare yourself. So before we go into the topic, I would like to introduce two key people here, Nick Vyas and Divya. And Nick comes from University of Southern California, Marshall School, as a director of education. He leads a large organization bringing in some industry thought leadership on an annual basis, as well as he's been awarded the Apex Excellence Award, and it's been an honor and a privilege to have him on the webinar, where he brings perspective globally, as well as from a premier academic institutions, along with some of the amazing research that he's been doing on the subject. Joining me also is Divya, who comes from Google Cloud, working with large enterprises, solving business transformation challenges, and how some of these technologies are helping overcome the crisis in whatever way or shape or form the technology is helping. My name is Manju Devdas. I'm the founder CEO of Pluto 7. We are one of Google's key partners. And I come with 19 years of predictive analytics experience, as well as 300 plus customer interactions, especially in the supply chain as it cuts across retail, healthcare, manufacturing verticals. And you'll hear more from Nick and Divya shortly. Here is the agenda. So we'll have Nick give his perspective as an industry leader or academic leader, looking from both the perspective from his industry experience as well as academic view, how he sees the world, how he sees the disruption, and what we should all be taking away from that conversation to apply in our own context. Then Divya will be talking about how cloud is helping in its own way to help mitigate the pain to the extent possible. And then when I get into my section, I'll be talking about what are other various industries doing about it, and how do you go about taking some of those learnings in your own context. And then we'll have about 20 minutes of Q&A. With that, let me pass it on to Nick.
Well, thank you, Manju, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So let's get into sort of our next 15 minutes. What I would like to do is highlight how we see the supply chain disruption, what has happened, why did it happen, the scale that it happened, and what underpins the global supply chains. So let me just briefly, who we are. So of course, I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Global Supply Chain Management. I'm also the Academic Director for Masters of Science in Global Supply Chain Management and faculty at the business school within data science and operations, right? So we have our Masters of Science program. Our center, our goal is really has been connecting the world to what we call the NEAR, Network Education and Advanced Research. So quickly, in my 15 minutes view, what I want to make sure that I cover with you is current situation, how is it impacting global supply chain? And what is the disruption in global supply chain meant to the global economy? And I'll just have one quick slide about if you're a small business or if you are mid-sized enterprise to large enterprise, what are some of the things you can do to sort of counter the impact? And I know Manju and Divya will further provide the guidance on that. So this is as of last night, 10:20, when I updated the slide, right? We have now totally confirmed case of 786, and I bet you if you look at it now, it's probably crossed 800,000 mark, right? 37,000 deaths and about 166,000 plus recovered. But what's interesting here in the slide that you want to see is the US number, which is on the top left-hand corner, that we have now surpassed the number of incidents across the world, right? So if you go back to these narratives 4 weeks ago, we were just beginning to see a couple of incidents specifically focused in New York and Washington. And then California came about it after the fact, right? But so what this actually shows you in the middle of the screen, which is a global map, is highlights through the red concentration that this is actually a global pandemic. And if you just look at it in 3 different ways, the data as of last night, both in the confirmed cases, the logarithmic trend, and daily increases, it really pinpoints that we're not done yet. In fact, we're far from being done, meaning the trend shows that we are way far out before the trend becomes flat. And the flat basically means the number of incident rates are contained. And then once we go to that phase, to about 2.5, 3 weeks, we will start to see a decline. So this is actually just sort of an indication of what's on the horizon. So let's look at it. Why supply chain? I mean, you go back to the last 120 years, and you map this, and you realize that the Spanish flu, which was in 1918, which killed over 106 million people, right? A part of the reason for that large fatality was because World War I had wrapped up, a lot of troops actually came back, but beyond that, we didn't have a public healthcare sector in place to do that. But also one has to understand the supply chain at that point was not as globally interconnected as what we have now. So what you see here, the One Belt, One Road, just to illustrate how China's effort to build this OBOR initiative, connecting waterways, railways, airways, human flow, physical flow, data flow, and creating this global cluster of networks that intertwine our world as we know today, right? So when you see this network, and I'm just giving you an illustration on a very small sample size of 87 suppliers, look at the complexity laid over 4 continents with over 57 nodes. And you disrupt one of these nodes, you disrupt the entire supply chain for those suppliers. So this is the first time in human history, what I call this virus as the event of the century, is because it has really disrupted all 4 major 5 nodes, from raw material acquisition, which is from mining, consolidation of essential minerals, to the suppliers, to the manufacturing, distribution, and the last mile, which are our end customer. So we see that unlike other previous events, this only has been able to influence on every single consolidated nodes, as we know. Impact is very different than SARS because our initial narratives that we saw in our society, where people are trying to compare this to the flu, or the SARS, or the NARS, or Ebola. But one has to understand that when we talk about this, the size of where it originated, which is China, back in 2000 and 2008 and 2003, the Chinese influence on the global economy was not as big as what it is today. So you now have a large two economy, US and China, being disrupted at the same time, and then the rest of the world is joining in. So impact of this is now really being felt across the world. And it is likely to continue from tourism, hospitality to aviation, airlines. We're seeing that they're getting hammered. Automotive, oil and gas, the lowest, minus out the Saudis and Russians fighting about the output, causing additional pressure on it. But just think from simply the demand side. 60% of the world population is in isolation. So the demand has certainly dropped. On top of the production, the supply side, we have two large producers, Russia and Saudi Arabia, is on sort of a dispute in terms of the control of the output. And that's causing a tremendous pressure on it. Consumer product, nobody's buying besides the essential commodity. And this is going to have a huge impact on global economy, as we are now seeing, and then obviously consumer electronic and semiconductors. So each of this sector has disrupted, but they will actually disrupt at the different rate, and the recovery will be very different based on the sector that you're in. Again, this impact is felt, and we're looking at the data from January and February. Blank sailings, which is what is known as the empty sailings, has been incredibly high. And this translates into the volume. 40% of the goods that's consumed in not only the lower 48, but all 50 states and every municipality in this country comes through the San Pedro Bay, which is part of Long Beach and Los Angeles. Right? Each day of reduction in volume equates to $2 billion in a GDP hit. So imagine this volume translating into March, which numbers have not been posted as of yet, but I likely to see the same projection for the month of March and likely to be continued on to the April. Specifically, it's imports coming out of China continues to struggle. So even though what data indicates that Chinese factories are coming back, but they don't have market to supply to. The demand will continue to diminish, and it will create continue to create the impact what we're looking at it. So if we look at the COVID-19 on supply chain and beyond, we should continue to see China, the delays for key essential commodities to be 4 to 6 weeks, and they have already at 80% of the capacity, but very low on the demand. The fear in China is a second spike, what we call the snakehead event, in which if the Wuhan population that's been confined for 6 weeks now start to travel across other provinces in China, can it potentially spike up the second waves of infection? And that is yet to be known because we don't have the data on that second spike. But that is one of the biggest fear on the market is if you release the constraints and containment too early, what it can do in terms of this spread, right? Likely that we are going to see that China will continue to be dominant, but there will be simply a lot more China plus strategy being deployed. To where, it's the unknown. It depends on how Southeast Asia recovers, how India recovers, and how Latin America recovers. Right? So what we see is truly a global pandemic driving global nodes of supply chain, global economic impact that is felt across all continents, and it is agnostic from the country to country, continent to continent, right? Carrying on to this is politics. I think the current administration's China's hawkish policy will continue to enforce the decoupling of China, supply chain from China-centric supply chain to Indo-Pacific or other country sort of base supply chain, right? At the end of the day, no one is spared from the pain. and shortages are felt across the world. Inflation is likely to surge, and we will see how this will spread to the rest of the economy. So what's next? I think the fallout that we saw, market is somewhat exuberant in terms of rebounding from the low. I'm not going to touch the economic side of it because I'm not the expert at it. But from supply chain disruption and what supply chain contributes in terms of the size of the economy, we are still not out of the woods yet. Supply chain reset is likely to be another 4 to 6 weeks at the earliest, or it could be as far out between 2 to 6 months. Different data points suggest different recovery rate, but what we're likely to see is the nearshoring and onshoring. We started to see this trend, and we will certainly see the more global slowdown occurs, more companies will try to bring their manufacturing bases, their supply chain nodes, close to the customer and close to home. The big issue here that I'm really focused and concerned about it is human capital reskill set. Right? I don't think the disruption, an outcome of that disruption, and what is going to be impacted on human capital. We saw just yesterday 3.2 million unemployment claim, which will be likely to run higher at the end of this week and will continue on. How will this get reintroduced back into the workforce? And what would that look like? That's yet to be seen. And last but not the least, emerging technology and robotics. If this was a peripheral opportunity just a month ago, now this becomes a reality at home. Companies would have to embrace, anticipate, and adapt without any option. And those that are successfully being able to embrace and integrate quickly will really reap the benefit. So with that, I will pass over to Divya for her to carry on her views on this. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Nick. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. So thanks, Nick. I think those were really good insights on, and I think it's important that we kind of discuss this topic today. But hopefully things will get better and we'll be back up and running soon. So to quickly introduce myself, my name is Divya Chandra and I'm a cloud partner engineer at Google. And for the next 10 minutes or so, I want to talk a little bit more about this challenge in the supply chain disruption, but also talk about how technology and capabilities with cloud can help you reduce certain risks and mitigate certain risks associated with this global supply chain disruption. So I put up this slide, to talk about the manufacturing industry and the challenges that are associated with manufacturing industry. If you typically see it, it's across every aspect of a product life cycle, right? I mean, whether it's research and development, supply chain management, sales, marketing, there always been different challenges. But today's situation is a bit unique with the way, Nick kind of laid out that with most of the population kind of isolating and quarantining, we've seen a demand spike for certain items and a plummet in the others. I mean, you would have seen this at your local grocery chains when, as a consumer, that some of the aisles are empty and some are not. And, we've had these weather-related disruptions and disruptions due to other problems earlier, but this is a very unique situation because with this kind of disruption, we've also seen that people are not able to get to work. So that adds another dynamic to this challenges in the whole product life cycle and all of the other end-to-end business objectives. But on the brighter side, we also see that manufacturing industries today are, looking at digital transformation initiatives and are looking to digitally transform their production value chain and drive process improvement. we've seen that a lot of companies are using technology to modernize their environment and drive process improvements with the same, and that has definitely allowed for growth and transformation. We see that about 2/3 of companies today are globally prioritizing all of these efforts and are using either artificial intelligence or machine learning and all of these technologies combined together, and are partnering with companies like Google to lead that initiative. Now what I want to do is to kind of focus a little bit on what I'd like to call the digital backbone of an intelligent supply chain. And if you observe this slide, there are a few key trends that you can that we can consider. Nick mentioned it. As supply chain spans continents today, there are billions of devices that are connected, and they're all generating data. And we've seen a massive shift in the scale of the data, which is new, but also with the complexity of all of this data and analysis, we see that there's a need for real-time insights to this data, and also personalization based on the business profile and the product of the companies. Also on the other side, we've also seen there's a shift towards automated intelligence with prescriptive and predictive analytics. And also when it comes to user experiences, there's been a whole new paradigm shift there as well. So when you think about the supply chain and connect all of these dots together from end to end, we are in need of an innovative ecosystem that's able to connect all of these dots together and leverage the data in newer ways. And also, if you look at the technology trends right at the bottom of the slide, it's interesting to see that a lot of these industries today are matured and evolved, and are focusing their efforts on driving this transformation and leveraging technologies like cloud, big data, and machine learning to solve these kind of problems. So how can companies address the risk of supply chain disruption? To keep things kind of simple, I think there are three important aspects to this. One is the visibility of the data. So we want data that is not really siloed, but aggregated, federated, optimized, and clean data that can be leveraged for us to make better and accurate decisions. Right. So visibility of data is the number one thing, and to have a centralized repository of the data is something that needs to be driven. Second thing is to drive more accuracy and efficiency in the decision making itself. And here we feel that automation is the key to all of this, and using ML or machine learning to process data at scale and efficiently is also important. And frankly, that's not really possible at the human level, and machine learning definitely shines in that area. And also using AI to deliver the user experiences at a different level. Today, think about digital chatbots or predictive and prescriptive analytics. All of that is definitely making a huge impact. And lastly, I think Nick spoke about this in his last slide, where he was talking about the after effects or the cascading effects of this whole supply chain disruption. And again, when you think of AI and ML, these technologies kind of help you model and predict those what if scenarios to kind of get a futuristic vision on what the future state looks like, and help you plan and prepare for what's coming, right? So, think back on my previous slide, and, if you think of the technology enablers there, did I go back too much? Okay. Yeah, if you think of my previous slide where I had the technology enablers, you will observe that although technology is, all of these technologies do enable all of these transformation, it's important to choose a platform that is able to connect all of these dots, like I mentioned. You need a platform that manages all of this collection of data and processes all of this big data, optimizes it using machine learning, and then connects, helps you to create those new user experiences with AI and all of the new advancements. And that is where, cloud platforms like Google fits in and helps you with that. This particular slide that's come up, I just wanted to double click on my previous slide and talk about this. We all agree that data is key to digital transformation. And the good news is that all of the industries that we are talking about today, whether it's retail, hospitals, manufacturing, all of them are, data rich environments. And manufacturing as well, it's an environment that has, you have data from pretty much all aspects of business, whether it's commercial, design, production, customer experiences. You also have data from suppliers, logistic handlers, also data that's not really a part of the industry, but that can impact the industry, like weather services and, data that generally comes from the other sources. And also IoT is playing a big role in manufacturing industries today, and they become another data source for us. And collecting and aggregating all of this data and centralizing it is a key part of building this ecosystem. And also, once you start collecting all of this data, how you use machine learning and big data is the next step towards building that ecosystem. One of the challenges today is that, if you think of a manufacturing industry, it's always been the amount and the variety of the data and the inability to gain useful insight from this. The traditional systems, they don't really scale very cost effectively, and when it comes to managing variety of data, it kind of gets complex to analyze this. It used to take time to generally run the reports and generate all of those reports, and sometimes probably too late before we can react and act. So when you think of the traditional BI tools that we normally use, they solve about 80% of the use cases that we see today. But it's important to focus on that last 20% as well, because those are the ones that can help you really transform the way you do business. And this 20% is dramatically difficult to solve, as well as very time consuming, and that's where machine learning is tailored to kind of help with those use cases. And that's where big data and machine learning can definitely make an impact in creating this ecosystem as well. And finally, to kind of wrap things up, and to go ahead in this webinar, I think it's important to understand that we need to create that innovative ecosystem that's able to drive and enable this digital thread, which is basically connecting every end of the business, which impacts the supply chain management. As well as that data is obviously the byproduct of connecting all of this data is also going to give you opportunities to create new business, but also creating digital replicas or digital twins of this data and processes and interdependencies will give you an opportunity to create those what if scenarios using AI and ML and model them and pretty much figure out what the future state looks like. And cloud definitely helps in all of these three aspects. The other thing that I kind of mentioned it in the beginning of my deck about how people are not getting to get to work, and cloud also is able to deliver that kind of digital workforce that's the need of the hour, because at some point or the other it is definitely going to impact the supply chain management, and being able to collaborate and deliver that digital workforce will also be of key importance. So you know I think the main important point that we're trying to drive here is that technology is definitely an enabler to kind of mitigate some of these risks, and it's time that we start thinking about creating that smart supply chain function, and using technology to do the same. Hey, over to you, Manju.
Thanks, Nick and Divya. So if you look at, Nick gave the big perspective about what's happening around the world, the complexity of the supply chain today versus what it existed, and potentially what the trends could be, and more importantly, giving you guidance on what to expect, especially the big ticket items like reskilling the workforce and so on, right? So and then Divya gave a perspective on how technology plays a role. What I will take you through is what does it mean? What are we seeing from an industry perspective, working with large enterprises, mid-size, right, and in some cases even SMBs around the world? How are they looking at all of these things? How are they handling the situation? My goal over the next 12 to 13 minutes is to give you a view of it, but we'll also anchor to a few specific problems. Nick described the demand and supply. If people are not moving, if they're not stepping out, who is buying? There are certain categories of products or segments or industries and verticals which directly get impacted because of drop in the demand. Versus the exact opposite, there are certain the commodities which is of very high demand now, which is both are going out of sync with their normal demand patterns. Demand and supply go hand in hand. Now, what does that look like in different industries? My goal over the next few minutes is to give you that view of the different industries, anchoring to the supply and demand effect. And within that effect, the first concept that I would like to highlight, and which is relevant as I speak through the rest of the industry example, is the bullwhip effect. We are all humans. We as consumers are humans. When we go walk into a retail store to make purchases for our family, we are humans. When we are part of an enterprise running a supply chain, we are humans. We are bound to make emotional decisions, even when data is presented in front of us. The person in an enterprise making a purchasing decision is also a person looking at the stock market in the same hour. So keeping that in mind, that there is a human psychology that plays in the demand effect. When a consumer tries to hold a particular commodity product at home just because he has a fear of what's going to happen with coronavirus, and that in turn has a magnifying effect at the retailer, where they tend to aggregate all the consumers who are trying to buy more and thinking that, okay, typically they buy 2 quantities, now they're buying 4. So the retailer wants to anticipate and buy and stock 6 for that consumer. Now the wholesaler is then extrapolating that and saying, man, I'm seeing this trend, so maybe this is I need to stock more so that I don't run out of stock. So this cascading effect continues. So the real effect of the actual demand may be 2, but by the time it hits the supplier, it magnifies to a quantity of 8. That is up to a point where you see this virus potentially keep creating this effect. And then what happens when the virus dies down? There's a reverse effect where the supplier and manufacturer and wholesaler and retailer, everybody has more inventory than they have, and then has a cascading effect on the consumer. Consumer is not going to buy more than what they need because this situation has gone away. So that's the bullwhip effect of the demand appearing in a multiple factors and so on. Now, it's not just a demand problem, right? When a demand goes up, there's a supply, there is shipment, there is labor. All of these has a cascading effect. You have to visualize all the nodes that Nick was talking about in his network. Our supply chain is complex. You as a consumer is affecting that whole supply chain layer at every level. And when you look at it from an enterprise perspective, and I'll be quoting a few examples of enterprises, they have to look at their enterprise as the whole supply chain. They have to look at not only themselves as an enterprise, they deal with manufacturers, contract manufacturers, their engineering organization, Should they be changing the product? Should they be designing the products? Or based on a new situation or new demand? Or the distributors who are, in some cases, are overstocking or understocking, just like how we might be stocking some cereal boxes or certain fruits and vegetables. Even in enterprises, they are overstocking and understocking. As we are talking to these enterprises, they know that the potential effect, but like Nick mentioned, it's once in 100 years. They don't have a reference point of how long and how soon or how bad this impact would be. And then there is the end consumer, right? So where the distribution is happening. So there is a cascading effect. The centralized view of all of this is important more than ever, and it will continue to be important. And many of these enterprises or businesses hope that they could get a full control of everything happening in the supply chain nodes, all the way from parts to manufacturers to warehouses, or in some cases like automobile industry, the service centers, right? So while it might come across as, okay, now we have to solve the whole supply chain problem, well, not so much. I mean, you have to start somewhere, and it is generally that it's not like all your lean or Six Sigma or total quality management concepts go away. They all have its place. They have proven time and again that that is the right thing to do. However, you have a new scenario where when you try to optimize your supply planning, that is not necessarily working for this scenario. To start with, the most common pattern that we are starting to see is getting control on your forecast, because forecast, it's very hard to predict, having predicted this scenario, no matter which statistical model you used, for the most part, unless you are in a business where you lasted for more than 300 years and you have seen the pandemic appear during World War and before that and so on, and you're able to project that, which is very, very few exceptions. So start with getting your forecasting right, and also get deeper with your customer, understand the demand pattern, not just what they say or behave or the signals show right now, but what they might do 3 months, 6 months later, when you bring this external data and merge with their demand signal and say they might be saying something, but they'll actually do something else. And you have to, because of the scale at which you'll do, you have to think about some automations. I'll quote a few examples of the real world problems that we're dealing with today, right? We deal with certain grocery stores where they have some unusual situations of people overstocking or understocking. Some stores where certain aisles are empty and certain are not, right? If you look at the aisles which are empty, are typically the ones which are the grains and the beans and those things which are longer lasting. People tend to hoard them. Perishable, you can't hoard them. Now, the problem we had to solve in this case was around how do you prioritize and how do you assort the right products in the right location, and how do you plan your inventory supply and demand. So it starts with planning the demand right. The reverse situation is with the retailers, fashion products. If people are not stepping out of home, who is going to buy all those fashion products? Now, what happens to this inventory of 90 days? Fashion industry has an unusual cycle. If you miss the fashion for this 6 months, it's gone. It's useless product for the most part. Now they have to forecast demand at a consumer level, consumer lifetime value, and map that to product and see, will it really sell or should we have a sale and so on. And you're talking about personalization for tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, and in some cases hundreds of thousands. These are enterprises who are $20, $30 billion in revenue. Then you have to think about, again, in the food industry, consumer packaged goods. There are certain consumer packaged goods which have higher demand, certain lower demand. In this case, we had to look at how to use preventive maintenance. Although this was a preventive maintenance, saw improving the beer filtration and so on. Even in this industry, there is some disruption, and but there are some smart enterprises who are looking at it very holistically, this being one of them, and making the right moves. Then there are companies who distribute food products and they have SLAs to corporations and so on. They are using these technologies to come up with ways to optimize their distributions and change adapting to the situation, because now if corporations are closed, schools are closed, how do you adapt to this, right? These are problems that are occurring for different enterprises. Now, one of the closest to the product that we are dealing with, or the customer we are dealing with, in this case, Dexterity, they make medical test equipment, blood tests, and so on. So, and these guys, they help with autoimmune disease testing the blood and at home and not having to go to the lab, and they get the results back. With the cost being 1/70th, which is pretty dramatically low when you do it at home. Now the same technology is being evaluated to see how you can help with this situation. Now again, it's a supply chain problem. It's less of a technology or an equipment problem. You could potentially use the same device for a coronavirus test. But what happens to the clinical trial? What happens to the supply chain? Is the supply chain ready to carry the samples safely? These are questions that are out there which are being solved. Now, when you look at these kind of problems, the common thing that you will see is, one is, of course, understanding the demand pattern in the context of what is happening, and knowing that your demand pattern will change as time progresses, not over forecasting or under forecasting. In this case, like in the semiconductor, we improve the forecast accuracy, and getting over 90% forecast accuracy when they're like at 70% is a big shift. Now the scenario is, of course, different, as in, if people are sitting at home, are they really going and buying new devices, new phones, new iPads? No, maybe not. And if the unemployment goes up, will they continue to consume more in the 6 to 9 months? Maybe not. So these are scenarios that has to be reviewed and planned, so that your supply planning is not over or under. Now, what does that look like when you try to apply these transformation technologies to your business, right? Now you're talking about using these capabilities. Again, one caveat, right? No technology by alone is going to solve this problem, the scale of the problem we're talking about. Technology almost always works in harmony with people, process, data, and your legacy environment, right? Even when you apply machine learning, cloud, and so on. It is always very important to look at it as like the change management is the biggest hurdle that you face in enterprises as we deal with enterprises trying to solve this, right? We are working with the retail companies where they want to now feed all this information. Hey, tell me what's going to happen over the next 1 to 12 months, given this scenario. There are ways you can enable machine learning models to get to better accuracy, better scenario planning. Most importantly is the scenario planning. The scale at which you can do the scenario planning, you cannot do it with traditional means, right? So, however, it is very, very important to make sure that your people are along with this in this journey. Otherwise, it's garbage in, garbage out, or you can run any number of scenarios, but are they really taking it and understanding what's the implication to the process? Are they going to go change the stores? Are they going to go change the promotions? Are they going to change the supply situations, right? In large enterprises like this, retailers, they have supply already sitting in the stores, in distribution centers, and so on. Now, when you flip the switch and say your demand curve is looking different for the next 6 months, what do you do with the supply, right? How do you move the goods? You don't even have people to move the goods. So things like that. Now, when you have these scenarios, first and foremost, right, you do not throw away your old knowledge or the old systems or the old processes or old business rules that are in place. They have been built in your enterprise and your systems over decades of knowledge. What you do look at is, can I reduce my time or the volume of decisions? Time to make a decisions or volume to make a decisions? Or can I delegate some of my decision making to these capabilities called cloud, AI, machine learning, and so on, so that I can really focus on exceptions of higher value, higher impact, where the decisions itself are complex. There are a lot of subjectivity and less of data patterns, and so on. So the delegation of your decisions, or majority of your decisions, could be in the form of having machine learning models running your demand forecasting for the SKUs. You can call it low volume SKUs or low dollar value SKUs, and so on. So you can focus on the higher volume or higher dollar value SKUs. Now, when you look at these things, so it's the machine learning model continuously learning and prioritizing for you. Hey, you need to go worry about these, because if you run excess and shortage of this, this is where you run into the real crisis. And having worked on this, we have put together a solution so that you can download it and do this yourself. If you go into the Google Marketplace, you will find that available. So with that, we have about 13 minutes for Q&A. There is a Q&A section on the right, and if you would like to ask some questions, you should feel free to go ahead and type those questions out. Between Nick, myself, and Divya, we'll do our best to answer. If not, we'll send you the follow-up response after this.